tell the audience about how you got started in real estate.
Welcome to the Masters in Real Estate podcast with your host, Tanner Webster.
All right, Hayley Pratt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tanner.
So wanted to start with a bit of your background. I'm excited to have you here just because of all of the municipal experience that you've gotten. So let's start with college at Utah State. What'd you do there?
Great. Yeah, so right out of high school, I initially wanted to be a nutritionist, which was obviously not the route that I ended up going. But my undergrad at Utah State, I deviated to landscape architecture and environmental planning. I liked the built environment and how I could influence that. From there, I went to the University of Utah and got my master's in city and metropolitan planning, and a graduate certificate in urban design. Yeah.
And what were like some of the classes that you were taking and stuff that like you think back on that was important in both the undergrad and the master's degree?
In undergrad, I remember learning about the psychology of space and how you can create a space that results in people feeling comfortable, or how you can encourage community, and also just the psychology of creating walkable spaces and generating that visual friction while to encourage pedestrian activity. And I thought that was interesting. In grad school, I really liked my urban design studio, and one specifically, I had to design a building, and that was very uncomfortable. But it was fun. And I also had to take a land use law class, which I've always found land use law fascinating. And I think it's very applicable to regulation and zoning.
And to the listeners of the show, Hayley's been a personal land use consultant to me for the last 4 years. So we're getting a firsthand look over here. And you mentioned you learning about the placemaking. And I think every city has this beautiful idea, no matter how rural they are, of like a walkable community. How do you actually implement that? Like, what are some of the tangible things that you learned that you should do or cities should be doing in that?
To create a walkable community, a lot of it is generating activity along your streetscape. And that can be shops, it can be stoops from residential townhomes. That really just having interesting things to look at generates a more walkable neighborhood. So you could even adding different paving patterns and adding, pedestrian scale signage and details like that result in a more walkable neighborhood. And that's one reason why when I was in grad school, the shift of Euclidean zoning, which is land use focused zoning, kind of started going towards more of a form-based or design-based code. And that's what you're starting to see some cities trying to implement. And some are not super successful because they're using a form-based code that is way too sophisticated for their rural community. But you start getting into the specifics of how you can build a more walkable community. Well, Euclidean zoning only is a 2D map showing you where single family and commercial can be located.
So let's take a little detour for a second. So Euclidean zoning, I think that's most of Utah, correct? Except for some parts of downtowns.
I would agree with that. Well, and other cities are hybridizing them, which is probably a good route. But yeah.
And so with the Euclidean zoning, we want commercial here in this, we'll call it red. We want commercial in the red. We want large lot single family in the green. How does a form-based code work in comparison to that?
Yeah, so you start looking at your districts. So if you have a town center district, for example, you rather than saying, okay, here are uses that can go in this district. You're saying these are the building types that can go in this district. And these are the street types that can go in this district. And so all of a sudden, the uses that we've been trying so hard to control, the building form actually starts to control the uses. Because if you have a more urban building form, you're not going to get industrial uses moving into these more urban office, And so you're paying more attention to the envelope that's interfacing the pedestrian realm than the uses that are in it.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. It's a little over my my pay grade, but that's why you're on here. Okay, so going back, master's degree, and then you mentioned before the show you were doing some stuff with South Salt Lake City.
Yes, I was consulting for South Salt Lake, helping with a design study that they wanted to help guide a form-based code that they were planning on drafting. The design study was about density blending because they had a bunch of single-family residential neighborhoods, and then transit stops, which obviously you want density around transit to help with ridership, and those are the areas that you're going to get a more walkable neighborhood. And so they wanted to figure out how they could appropriately blend multifamily and more intense uses into, so that it wouldn't negatively impact the single family residents that it was adjacent to.
How did you do that?
A lot of it is stepping the building, and a lot of it is stepping the building, but there are different forms that you get densities that hide the densities. And that's really the study looking at that.
When you say stepping, you're talking height, moving from, this single family home, which is maybe, if it's 2 stories, maybe 25-ish feet tall at the highest, I would assume.
Yeah.
And then up to maybe a 30-foot townhome, up to a 60-foot apartment, up to a 75.
Yep.
Is that what you mean on that?
Yep. And then you look at like window placement, because residents get antsy with privacy and screening and a lot of different things that you can do.
That sounds really fun. Okay, so from South Salt Lake, then you became a full-time city planner there.
Yep. And that was a rude awakening, because when you go to grad school and they talk about planning, you think you understand the theory of it, but you don't understand the regulation and how codes are written and the politics of it and just how hated you are when you're on the public side. And that's one of the biggest things that I think I was punched in the face with was it just felt like I was working really hard for these communities. And really, people don't like being told what to do with their land or what's happening with their land. And so you're working really hard trying to help build a better community, at least what you think you're doing. And the residents just resent you for it. So that was tough. And just learning how to navigate that and learning how to read a code and how a code is organized. You're never going to understand how a code is organized. It changes from city to city, and just making sure that you listen to staff on how and ask staff where to look for those codes is important. But yeah, so at the city, it was really fun. The city, you're very tight knit. At least the city that I worked at was very tight knit because you're a team working through these projects. I was the front end, but I also with the zoning, I did long range zoning, form-based code for some of the transit areas, but I also approved building permits and things like that. But you're really collaborating with the building department, public works, fire, and you become a really strong team. And so that was fun. That part was fun.
And the problem with being a city planner is I think you're hated by pretty much everyone. The developers kind of hate you because you can't put 400 units on an acre, and the citizens hate you because someone's putting a duplex next to another duplex near a single family home. So I think, kind of taking another sidebar into the NIMBYism that is currently happening, from your experience as a planner, what would you say is the biggest reason for NIMBYism? Is it, building values coming down, just general change? What do you think is the biggest?
No, I think it's emotions, honestly, which is why it's the most unpredictable thing to battle against. People, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is triggered by fear. They're scared of traffic. They're scared of people invading their privacy. They're scared of property values. It's just when you start messing with something that is their home, people are incredibly emotional. And so I think respecting that and trying not to let it like infiltrate your morale is important. Sometimes people are just jerks and they're just not good community members, but I think a lot of times it's just fear. And so one of the things that I think is important is you do what you can within reason when you're addressing NIMBYism, and you track it. You track it well. You show the iterations, and then you make sure that those are part of your presentation when you're going in front of council, because those community members who are anti are going to be in that public meeting, and so you're never going to get them on board. So just make sure that you show those public officials, those elected officials, that what you have done, so that you can show that you're being reasonable and they're not. And I think that's
task.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
It is a tall task, and you're never going to win against them. It's just it's way too close to home, literally. So.
Yes. You can put a duplex next to my house. I really don't care. Okay. So going back, so South Salt Lake, then you switched to IBI Group, which was a full service architecture firm.
Yep. Multidisciplinary design firm that focused on transit-oriented developments. And I specifically did a lot of master planning and visioning for larger developments. I also wrote form-based codes for cities. And I think that was really helpful, because one city will operate one way, and it's good knowledge to understand that, but each city will operate very differently from their neighbor. And when I was at IBI, I got to work with a lot of different cities and also developers on the other side, to help a project get to a finish line, or help an area get closer to actually being built. So I wrote form-based codes for cities, because most city planners don't have the training to do a more design-based code.
Okay. And then after IBI, you started working for our good pal, Michael Brodsky.
Yes. And he was a fantastic teacher. And I did acquisitions and entitlements he's a Hamlet development. Now Brodsky Built is a production builder and developer. And I helped oversee entitlements, acquisitions, and also the horizontal improvements for the subdivisions.
And this was all single family and townhomes, correct?
Yes.
Just along, what was the furthest south that you went? Was it Pleasant Grove?
Yep.
And then as far north?
Me personally, I know that
he's been around for 40 years.
He's
been everywhere. I think, we've talked offline about how just brilliant Michael is, but when you first started working with him, what were some of the key things that you learned from him, and I guess things that you still apply today at Castlewood?
Key things that I learned were, first, the development process. So I understood the entitlement side fairly well at that point, but I did not understand those steps that were required before that. So coordinating with utility companies and getting the postmaster to sign off on your plat and get your addressing and things like that. That was incredibly useful.
Side note on that, I think part of the inspiration for this entire podcast and platform is just all of the dumb questions that you have to ask someone, but you just don't know who to ask. And I think one of the perfect examples of this was I was trying to put a mailbox on one of my properties, and I had no idea how to do it. You can Google it, you won't find out. So I called Hayley, and she said, all you have to do is call the postmaster. I'm like, I don't know who the postmaster is. So,
Yeah.
And can you dig a little bit more into the development versus entitlement process? Because I think that's pretty misunderstood. I think they're kind of lumped together as one entire thing.
And they do go hand in hand. And when you say development process, you mean just getting all of the utilities to sign off. And
yeah, I guess let's take this side path of, let's take a raw piece of ground and I want to go build 12 duplexes on it. Let's walk through the entire process from A to Z, from basically site selection or site acquisition to a delivered product. So I'm a broker, I bring Hayley a piece of 3 acres in West Valley. What are you looking at?
the first thing that I would look at is the zoning map, and obviously the parcel itself. You do your visual observation of any site constraints. So if you notice a bunch of trees, pay attention to it, because that's usually it can indicate water. Just anything that could be a red flag, you just put down and you set that aside. Then you pull up the zoning map and you see what existing uses are permitted on that. And so the zoning map, it ties in, and it ties into a city code. And so you pull up the zone and it says R110. And that R110 is associated with a written list of rules that go over permitted square footages and open space requirements. And they can get absolutely, you can't guess what each ordinance is going to hit on, other than, sometimes they'll just include things with architecture. You just have to read through it and get a handle on that. So I would go through that, and I would then anticipate my densities based off of physical constraints, and then the actual existing zone. And then I would give the city a call, and I would talk with the planner, and I would go over what my assumptions, I would go over my goals, and then I would always ask them, is there anything else that I should know that's become an issue? And that's a big, important question, I think, that you need to ask. Yep. Because the city planners have gone through 5 calls already about something similar that day. And so when you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, developers usually have a big problem with, this impact fee, or with this open space requirement, or height limitation based off, existing grade versus future grade. Just they just know it's going to be the problem. So you ask that, and then you try and get it under contract.
And for you, I think everybody does this differently, but when are you starting to work with architecture and engineering on this? Are you shooting this over to an engineer saying, hey, here's this site, this is kind of what I was thinking, is this attainable, can you lay something out for me?
Yep, that's one of the first steps. If I can't do a quick sketch myself, I'll send it over to my civil, and they'll put together a concept plan, a density study, basically.
Okay, so you get that concept plan, and then you kind of can back into the price that you can pay for this, whether it's a development yield or kind of just A plus B minus C equals D in my profit, that type of thing.
I have really back of the napkin development horizontal costs for each product type that we build. I have back of the napkin costs for our multifamily that we build, and I pull comps. I put together rental estimates, rental rates, and then I back into what I can actually pay for the land.
Okay, and so we get this property under contract, and we have a very rare and elusive seller that allows us to close at time of permit, or somewhere deep into the future, call it 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is, depending on the scope. You get that under contract, you need to rezone it. What are you doing next?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to what you're just saying, though. As far as if what I do, you never want to assume that you can get entitlements. So you want to make sure that you don't close before it. So I would never actually, I will not, unless it's a by right use, I will not close on anything that is a question mark when it comes to entitlements. Public bodies are so unpredictable. You do not do that. So at least I don't.
Yeah.
What?
We're going to have to clip that and just send it to every broker in the state. That's sounds nice. Okay, so you get it under contract.
Yep.
Then what are you doing?
Okay, so I get it under contract and I put together my first application package as soon as possible. Typically, my entitlement timeframes and my zoning due diligence, because you've got your physical inspection due diligence, your geotechnical, your environmental, all of that. Those are so much faster than my entitlements, because I have with approvals, if you're rezoning or whatnot, you have to go through public meetings, and those public meetings are only held a certain number. So usually it's 2 times a month, and you've got planning commission and city council, and there are noticing requirements for each. So with each entitlement that has to go to the city council, you're looking at least 3 weeks noticing for planning commission, and then once they make a recommendation, then it's another 3 weeks to city council. And so it's just, and each city varies, but I need to make sure that I start my application, submit my application immediately, because that's going to be the most time sensitive thing. Absolutely.
And what's generally the scope of that application? Is it just like, hey, my name's Hayley, I want to build some duplexes? Like,
well, I start with that because then I'm like, I need to try and make you like me, you know?
Exactly.
That's the number one thing. People going into a city, if you're, pounding your fists, someone's going to want to help you. And guess what? They know how to interpret their code and you don't. So no, I definitely start talking about, kids and, trying to relate and tell, because you want them to want to help you. So tell them about who I am. Usually my background helps because I have a planning background. So it does seem like people feel relieved. Staff feels a little bit of relief because they're like, oh, I don't have to hold her hand and explain to her what setbacks are or something.
Yeah, I feel like you just described every interaction I've ever had with the city in the opposite way. So, okay.
So
application.
Yeah. So if it's a zone change, you're going pull up the checklist. They're going to have each city will have its own different thing. And entitlements mean a very different thing case by case. So a conditional use permit is a form of entitlement. And what an entitlement means is you're working through a process, a legal process to give you the legal right to develop the property in a way that you want to develop it. So it sounds vague, right? And that's because it is, because each city, each area is going to have its own different set of steps. And so, it really depends. But if it was a rezone, then I would, rezones are supposed to be pretty straightforward. You don't have to do too much, but it's just case by case. That's probably not crazy helpful. It may be more helpful if I dive into a specific instance. Okay. So, for example, I was looking at a property in a city in Utah, and I have a rezone, and it's an overlay. I'm rezoning to an overlay zone, which is now we're just getting, yeah. So, and an overlay zone is something. It's like another layer on top of the zoning map that they put different requirements or abilities in that specific area. It's really just a zone, but they like to get cute.
And usually those overlay zones have some sort of incentive, right? Like we want more density here, or we want senior housing or something like that. Or is it just like, hey, we want an overlay here for this reason?
Go look at the overpressure overlay zone over by the Northrop Grumman Lake.
I will do that.
So that's the overpressure, that's a limiting overlay. But
yep. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Learning stuff over here too. Okay, sorry to cut you off, Sid.
No, it's okay. So in this instance, part of my rezone is, or part of my rezone to this overlay zone is a development agreement, which is very unique. And a development agreement is an agreement that basically packages up, and this is going to simplify it, but you create your own zone. Basically, you create your own design guidelines. You create your own, and it's very site specific to your project. So I'll have full blown improvement. I'll have elevations, and that is part of my rezone, is that development agreement. So you can see how different each city is going to be and each scenario is going to be. So I look at that and I start highlighting anything that will impact my density, because that's the most important factor that I have to calculate. And so the fact that this city doesn't allow you to include washes in their density calculation. So I have to remove the acreage of that wash going through the property from my estimated density calculation, and just stuff like that. But and from there, I have called the city. I'm going to be meeting with the city and going over a concept plan. And then I'm going to be putting together a massive application package. But also, this project is not 4 duplexes. It's going to be like 500 units. So the scale is very different.
Yes. And that stuff costs a lot of money, like the architecture, the engineering. At what point are you feeling confident that you can build this project? I know it's a case by case, but for this specific example, when are you comfortable saying, all right, I'm willing to shell out some money for this project?
I'm going to have to shell out money immediately on this project, and it's because I want it really badly. And that's, and I don't feel comfortable doing it that early on, but
and that's just the entitlement risk that you're taking. I mean, there's huge upside if you get it. If you don't, you're out. Good amount of money, but that's
typically I wouldn't want to be doing I'm very deliberate with when I start to incur cost. So if I were doing just a standard subdivision and I needed to go through a rezone, I would do just a straight up rezone. I would do no design work. I would submit my application, and I would put together whatever the application checklist had me do, and required me to do, but I wouldn't do anything more than that. And then once I got my rezone, I would then move forward with my subdivision application, which is civil. And so you want to be really deliberate in when you actually incur cost, because each layer of your entitlement should give you another layer of security that you can actually get what you're hoping to get on that property.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's step back a little bit more about talking and working with city and staff. You mentioned meeting with community and economic development directors. When would you do that, and what would you hope to accomplish in those meetings?
When do I do it?
Yeah. Do you meet with these people regularly and say, how can I help you accomplish your goals? Or is it, hey, I've got this site in mind and I want to talk to you about what we can accomplish here?
I generally try and create friends, become friends with them and stay in touch with them as much as possible. But it's usually triggered by a potential opportunity. But yeah,
and so you meet with these people. What do you talk about? Do they give you the, challenges that you're going to need to overcome and how you can overcome those? Or what do those conversations look like?
Yes, they do. Because they're hoping, cities want economic development. And if you go in and you're proposing something that they are that's helping achieve their vision, then yes, they're going to try and help you, and they're going to try and help you navigate. That's the biggest. So they'll know the political hot topics for example, they'll say parking has been a big issue, so make sure that you're armed with a parking study, because the council is going to tell you that you need that ammo, right? Or don't say multifamily, say I don't know, it gets really random, but yes, they help. And then they'll also point out, like, if they hear rumblings of property owners potentially getting ready to sell, they'll tell you, because usually the property owners are coming to them and expressing interest. That, I mean, they don't disclose anything that's not already, in line with what the property owner wants. But yeah, they have their hands in everything. They know when an application isn't moving forward. Like, if someone put it under contract, a property under contract, and they haven't been able to appease the city, and so they haven't gotten anywhere with their entitlement. So the city staff know what's going on in their entire city to an awkward level of detail. And so they're just a good source. Be nice to them. I mean, all they're doing is trying to appease. They have a politician who's their boss, and so, and then they have community members who are not always understanding of what a good plan is, and so come at an angle of trying to help them achieve the vision, and don't try and fight them, because it's useless.
And what are some of those things that you can, I guess there are sticking points like densities, but you've got to make concessions kind of on the fly with some of these meetings. Can you give some examples of concessions that you've seen people do?
Right, yeah, for sure. Walls. People always want walls. So, like, privacy. Yeah. Okay. So that's one. We've agreed to parking. Most of the time in the public meetings, you try and talk through the concerns that they have, and then if you're starting to see that they're not convinced, then ask to continue and come back with some sort of study that speaks to what it is that they're worried about. Usually it's a little unfounded, but
you're kidding.
I know.
You're talking studies like traffic studies,
parking. You could even do view shed. Like, there's a lot of different studies that you could try and consult with. But usually the concessions in the public meetings aren't massive. Like, maybe screening materials on one of the buildings, or if you've been collaborating with your planner closely enough, usually they've gotten you to a point where you've addressed a lot of the concerns, and if you haven't, then sometimes they'll step in. But yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about more kind of as a developer who does not have a planning background whatsoever. Let's talk a little bit more about the regional and local resources for developers. So, for example, like the Wasatch Front Regional Council.
Yeah.
Like who are some of these people, and what can they help you with?
So the Wasatch Front Regional Council is our MPO, which is our metropolitan planning organization. And each region has one. So in Utah County, their MPO is actually Mountain Land Association of Governments, I believe is what it's called. And they're a public-private entity that really focuses on more regional planning. So transportation is a key factor, and then town centers. But the cool thing about referring to your MPO is that they identify in their mapping. So if you go to their online mapping, Wasatch Regional Council, they'll have a map that shows where cities have told them where they want to see certain types of development. So it's like the perfect guide of like, oh, I want to build density, multifamily density, so an apartment, but it doesn't show on the city's map where they want that. The Wasatch Regional Council actually has the longer range plan for for these cities. And so that's always a good spot to look when you're trying to anticipate where development should go and where you think the city will, where it seems the city will be warmer to certain product types. So there's the MPO, and then you've got the county. And most of the time, the county kind of plays a secondary role to all of it because once you annex into a city, the county doesn't really get as involved because they're not the land use authority anymore. The city is. And so then you've got your local municipal government who has the land use regulations that they put on their city land.
Okay, so if I'm looking at a project that is not incorporated into a city yet, it's still in the county, I'm not working with the adjacent city, I'm working with the county specifically.
County and the township.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about some of the higher level political aspects, like, for example, the moderate income housing plan and those requirements, because I think if it was up to basically every neighbor in the entire state, there would not be any apartments ever built anywhere. So talk about the moderate income housing plan.
Yeah. So here in Utah, we're in a housing crisis, and I think that a lot of places around the state or around the nation are, but Utah is in a really bad spot with our housing and our affordability. And so each city, they have their own vision, and many cities in Utah used to be really rural. And so they're having a hard time transitioning from that rural to, there are actually people who need homes and are living here, right? And so they push back on housing. So the state got involved and required that each city generate a moderate income housing plan, and they actually identify how they're getting closer to how they're helping achieve this, how they're incorporating more affordable housing options in their city. And so the state got involved, and what the state has done is with those moderate income housing plans, if the city doesn't implement one, then they'll start to hold back certain state funds that each city needs. Like, I think transportation is one of the funding sources that the state is saying that they won't actually give the city if they don't implement a moderate income housing plan. The state has gotten more and more involved in land use because of this housing crisis that we're in. And I think it's a good thing, just so long as they're acknowledging, still looking to cities for those as the land use regulator. Okay.
And so on that note, working with cities on development specifically, I think a lot of people know about RDAs and RFPs and those types of situations. How do they actually work, though? Like, a city owns a piece of property and they want something built. Let's go through that process on that.
Yeah. So we usually hire a consultant who does a study, but so the RDAs and CDAs, redevelopment agency, they'll create geographic areas where they'll do what's called tax increment financing. And they have to collaborate with all the taxing entities, like your districts and the county. And basically, the gap between the taxes that are being generated today and the taxes being generated with the development, that gap that's created is then given back to the project. And I'm simplifying it, but that it's a great opportunity. And it also shows you where the city wants substantial development, which, again, in my experience, since I'm residential, it hasn't moved the needle a ton, because usually it's more beneficial because of the taxes generated by commercial, but it is always a helpful tool.
Let's talk a little bit about land use law in that regard. So I think there's lots of stories of people getting developers suing cities. And I think the most common one is the city saying, yes, you can build this project. And then a few years later, they said, never mind, no, you can't. So let's talk about land use law and how it impacts developers.
Yeah. So first, I'm not an attorney, so just making that. But as far as cities taking entitlements back, I haven't heard of that happening a ton, because it's very much so illegal, but to an extent. So with each entitlement, typically there's a time frame associated with your entitlement. And so it wouldn't be a city taking an entitlement back. It would be that your entitlement expired. And I think that that's a really important thing, especially in a market right now that we're in. Just the economy is so, how many projects do we know that have stalled out? And one of my key jobs here at Castlewood is entitlements. And we have 3 projects right now that we're waiting and reworking to get them to pencil. But I have an approval that expires annually. And so I have to know, I have to track when that expiration happens. And each city is going to have a different time frame that they have and a different benchmark. So in the project that I was just talking about earlier with the rezone and the development agreement, I think it's 2 years to be like 50% constructed. And then I am vested. And so they can't take it away. Vesting and entitlements are different, and that's a totally different conversation. But just make sure you pay attention, especially as projects are on hold, to how long your entitlements are locked in, because you can get in a really bad spot if they lag, or if it's a by right use. So you're just flying under the existing zone and it's a permitted use, that any adjustment to that existing zone, make sure you track when they're made. If there's any zoning amendment, make sure you know about it and you're checking in with the city, because I mean, a city can go in and change a parking ratio, a required parking ratio. And if you don't have your entitlements locked in, that's a full redesign, right? So just make sure you track that.
And what would be the process if, let's say those, I don't want to stress you out here, but let's say these entitlements do expire. Is it the entire process from A to Z all over again?
Yeah.
And so you have the risk of
owning very expensive land.
Yes.
Yes.
That sounds awful.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's an important from an investor standpoint. Make sure that you understand if you're a limited partner, make sure you understand while you're waiting this market out, make sure you understand how long that entitlement and what your GP is actually, how long that is actually locked in. Because I think that a lot of times LPs don't keep track of it. They think it's approved. And so then it's going to be approved forever until they decide they want to break ground. And that's just not the case.
That is not the case. And you probably just stressed out so many people right there. So that is absolutely
good thing to be stressed about.
Yes. I can't tell you the amount of deals I've been sent that are fully entitled that are not even close to started. So
yes,
I think that's an important topic to cover, unfortunately. And stepping back a little bit, going back to feasibility, I have here in my notes the squint test. Do you want to talk about the squint test?
So the best test that one can ever do is look. So whenever I should have brought this up earlier with Tanner's earlier question about one of the first things I do when I look at property is I look around the property. So I look at, for example, there's a piece of property that I want to get under contract that's being marketed as commercial. But I look at it and I'm like, I see apartments all around it, And so then I start getting excited. Yeah. And I'm like, well, it is like, over 10 acres. Maybe if we give them a little bit of their commercial, the city's commercial, my apartment use is consistent with what's around it. And so pay attention to what's around it, because it's usually a fairly good indicator of what you can get. And I mean, that's a very broad statement, but it's a much easier conversation to try and discuss with a city getting a use that is also next door than one that is nowhere near it. So pay attention to that, and then also red flag any single family because they're going to be coming out of the woodwork. So yeah. And then if you see a waterway, and this is the physical inspection squint test, if you see a waterway going through the property and the property just immediately adjacent to that one has like a trail around it, and like beautiful landscaping and then apartments, just so you know, they didn't do that out of the goodness of their heart. So they didn't decide to chunk up. I mean, you hope, and I mean, I would love to in a beautiful market
Money
where
is free.
Yes.
I definitely would.
But just acknowledge what's around it and what's been required in projects around it, because you need to make sure that when you're targeting your densities and things, that you put a big red flag on it.
So that kind of leads me to we were talking before the show, and my initial experience with entitlements was, I thought that you just went down to the city, and if you didn't pull your permit, you just argued with people for 6 months, and then they eventually gave you your permit. This was kind of my initial thought. And I've ran into so many deals where, starting off in the single family side, I was like, why can't I tear down this single family home? It's right next to a duplex. Let's talk about kind of those documents, like the future land use and the zoning map, and how those work. Because it's a lot of deals you could argue pass the squint test, but they don't. So let's talk about those.
So what you're looking at there is what's called a legally existing non-conforming use, that duplex. I mean, and that's when the squint test totally goes awry too. And that means that at one point duplexes were allowed, and someone built it, and then the code has now changed and it's not a permitted use anymore. And so one way that you can get an idea of what a city will support, city staff will support, is you pull up the general plan and the future land use map. And the general plan and future land use map, it's supposed to guide regulation. And so I was talking earlier about a zoning map amendment, but the step before that is that future land use map. And you look at that, and usually a future land use map will show a color, and then there are a list of zones that fall into that color, so to speak. And so
low density residential might R140 or R125 or something, or 25 or something like that.
Yeah. And just for a fun fact, those R110s, R18s, usually and not always, but usually that's associated with the square footage of the lot that's permitted. So R110 is 10,000 square foot lots. R18 is 8,000 square foot lots. It's just it's a good way to start acknowledging the existing zones, But yeah, so they'll list R18, R110, and R112. Okay. Well, then I look at the existing zoning, and I see that R112 is across the street. R112 is basically surrounding the property. You can bet that your ag, the most dense you're going to get, is not going to be your R18. It's going to be your R112. But it's always worth asking. Now, if you're not consistent with the general plan, which most cities will require you to do a general plan amendment. And those are hard to do if a city just updated it. So pay a lot of attention to when documents were adopted, because you're going to piss off cities if you go in and they just had a 2022 general plan amendment that cost them $20,000, and you're like, well, I don't really want to abide by it. So usually they're not going to want to support a general plan amendment if they just went through an update. So just pay attention to those dates, because it's pretty much not worth asking a general plan amendment if they just spent a ton of money updating it. Now, if you're consistent with the general plan, don't assume that that's going to get you your rezone here in Utah. The general plan in Utah is only a guiding document. In other states, the cities are actually required to adhere to it. But in Utah, it actually has no real teeth unless the city gave it teeth. So sometimes cities will write a code and say, yeah, our general plan is regulatory or whatever. But they can deviate from it, and they do frequently. So so the general plan, if you are going against it, it hurts you. And if you're going with it, it just means you're not hurt. It doesn't necessarily mean you get a ton of points, you know? If you're consistent with it, it just means that you're not injured by that. So general plans are really frustrating because it's probably my biggest issue. I think it's ridiculous how much time and effort is put into those documents, and then they're just completely disregarded. So
you mentioned how recently they were updated, like 2022, probably no go. At what point do you say, all right, I might be able to get around this? Like, are you thinking
city planner? No, more than 4. I would usually say 10, maybe
10.
Because 4 in city world is really recent.
That is true. Cities movement is slow. How often I know it depends every city, but how often are they redoing these plans?
So they're getting updated, I've noticed, more recently in Utah. And I think and this is just my speculation, so take it with a grain of salt, but with how active the state has been getting involved in the moderate income housing and also the housing and transportation reinvestment zones and station area planning and things, I've noticed that cities, there's been a surge of updated plans. So our Wasatch Front Regional Council, our MPO, also has grants that they're giving cities to help them update those general plans. So I would say recently a lot have been updated, but I would say maybe 5 years ago, maybe longer. Most of them were not updated. Maybe 10. Sometimes
Okay. To wrap this up, wanted to talk about a variance. What is a variance?
Well, geez.
I hear people say, well, you can do that project. You just got to get a variance. I don't think they know what they're talking about.
So one of the most stressful times in my recent career was trying to go for a variance. And variances are not something to take lightly. And people throw around that word. And every time they say it, and then I hear the context, I'm like, you really don't know what that means. Because a variance is very legal. And I went through a variance process not too long ago, and luckily city staff was very knowledgeable in what needed to be qualified in order to get that variance. But variance, it's showing unreasonable hardship. You have to prove that your property has an unreasonable hardship that you didn't know about and that is very unique to your property, that it doesn't apply to any other property, which is a really difficult argument to make. I highly recommend getting an attorney to make those arguments for you, because cities don't deviate from their code unless unless their codes give a reason for that deviation. So just an arbitrary variance, get out of jail free card is not. They don't do it because they just don't do it.
A variance is not, okay, in this zone I have 10-foot setbacks, but I'll see if I can get a variance to 5. No. What would be an actual example of a variance?
Oh, so for ours, we had, and of course you're going to quiz me on this. So for ours, it was the depth of our property and the grade of the existing road. We needed higher walls because the topography of our property was so steep that the city only limited like retaining walls to 5 feet or something like that. But the topography drop in order to get our driveway to meet engineering standards with the slope, we had to have the taller wall. And the dimension of the property, the elevation of the existing road, and it allowed for that variance. And I'm butchering it, but that's
so it wasn't. It sounds very specific to your
very technical.
And I think that was kind of the point I wanted to make, was like, it is not a change in setbacks. It is much more complicated than that.
It's having to do with your property. What is it that your property has that no other property has? And for ours, it was the dimension, the depth. The city was requiring us to have our road come in at a very specific location because of an existing intersection. And the depth of our site, the grade of our site, existing elevation of the existing road, and where the city was requiring our intersection to be located. That was why we got it. And we almost didn't get it. We almost got denied. It was ridiculously stressful. So even though the requirements were triggered a lot by what the city wanted, we almost didn't get it. So
that sounds awful. This is why entitlement risk is my least favorite risk to take, because frankly, it's the one I know the least about.
You don't want to do entitlement risk because entitlements are too risky.
Exactly. I think we'll end it there. So Hayley, thanks for coming on. We'll have you on.
Thank you, Tanner. I hope this was helpful. Anyone who wants to ask more entitlement questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm an entitlement dork. I love talking about it. So yeah, Tanner can share. Okay, thanks. Bye.